The sound of a heavy dumpster sliding against brick is the only warning. Then the wet thud of a body hitting the pavement. Anthony Tony Suits. Valenti is hyperventilating, his lungs burning in the freezing New York air. His hands are shaking so violently he can barely grip the steering wheel of the idling Buick. Across from him, a man is bleeding out, and the package, a briefcase containing $150,000 in union kickbacks, is nowhere to be seen. "You blew it again, Tony," a voice rasps from the shadows. It's the kind of voice that sounds like gravel underwater. Tony looks up. Standing there, illuminated by a flickering neon sign, is a man in a double-breasted Brioni suit that costs more than Tony's life. The silver hair is perfectly coiffed, defying the biting wind. It's John Gotti. He doesn't look angry. He looks disappointed, which is infinitely more dangerous. Gotti stares at the blood on Tony's collar, then at the empty passenger seat. "In this life, there are two types of people," Gotti says, his voice eerily calm as the sirens begin to wail 3 blocks away. "Those who carry the weight and those who are the weight. Right now, Tony, you're an anchor, and anchors get dropped in the East River. To understand how a kid from Howard Beach ended up trembling in front of the rising star of the Gambino family, we have to go back to the beginning. Tony wasn't a killer. He wasn't even a good thief. He was a legacy hire, the nephew of a dead captain trying to survive in a world of wolves. He had failed every pickup, botched every intimidation, and lost every cent he was trusted with. He was the joke of the Bergin Hunt and Fish Club. But tonight the joke stopped being funny. The sirens are getting closer. The blue and red lights are already reflecting off the damp brick walls. Tony looks at Gotti, pleading with his eyes. Gotti reaches into his coat, not for a gun, but for a cigarette. He lights it, the orange glow revealing a face carved from granite. "Get out of the car," Gotti commands. "If you stay, you're a victim. If you move, you might just become a man." The cost of failure in Queens isn't a pink slip. It's a permanent silence, and Tony was seconds away from hearing the last thing he'd ever hear. 3 weeks earlier, the Bergin Hunt and Fish Club, Ozone Park. The air inside the club was thick with the smell of espresso, stale cigar smoke, and the unspoken scent of power. Tony Valenti sat at a small folding table in the back, nursing a lukewarm coffee. Around him, men with thick necks and gold pinky rings laughed loudly, their voices booming against the wood-paneled walls. They ignored Tony. To them, he was a ghost, a reminder of a favor owed to a dead man. Tony's task that week had been simple: collect the weekly protection tax from 3 dry cleaners on 101st Avenue. He had come back with less than half. One owner had cried about his sick daughter. Another had simply told Tony to come back tomorrow. Tony, soft-hearted and desperate to be liked, had nodded and walked away. "Look at him," whispered Angelo Ruggiero, Gotti's right-hand man, nodding toward Tony. "The kid's got the spine of a chocolate eclair. His uncle is rolling in his grave." Gotti was sitting in the corner, playing a hand of gin rummy. He didn't look up, but he was listening. He noticed everything: the way Tony fidgeted with his cuffs, the way his eyes darted to the door every time it opened. Gotti saw a man who was afraid of his own shadow, and in their world shadow fear is contagious. Later that night, the rain started, a cold, miserable New York drizzle that turned the gutters into black rivers. Gotti called Tony over. The room went silent. The clinking of spoons against cups stopped. Tony felt his heart hammer against his ribs like a trapped bird. "You think this is a hobby, Tony?" Gotti asked, his eyes fixing on Tony's cheap polyester tie. "You think we're a social service for the incompetent? You failed the cleaners, you failed the bookies, you're failing at being a human being." Tony tried to speak, but his throat was dry. I just thought, if I gave them a break, they'd be more loyal next month, John." Gotti leaned forward, the smell of his expensive cologne cutting through the room's musk. "Loyalty isn't bought with kindness. It's earned through a singular rule, a rule you haven't learned yet. Come with me tomorrow. We're going to see a man about a debt. If you fumble this, don't bother coming back inside these doors." Tony realized then that his mercy was seen as a death sentence. He was one mistake away from being erased from the map of Ozone Park. The next morning, 10:45, a construction site in Lower Manhattan. The wind whipped off the Hudson River, carrying the grit of wet cement and the roar of jackhammers. Gotti and Tony stood on the edge of the site, watching a union foreman bark orders. Gotti wasn't wearing his usual flamboyant suit. He was in a dark overcoat, looking like a high-level executive. But the way the workers avoided his gaze told a different story. "Watch," Gotti whispered. "Don't speak. Just watch." The foreman, a burly man named Miller, had been skimming from the Gambino's concrete contracts. He was a tough guy, a man who had survived 30 years on the docks. When he saw Gotti, he didn't run. He tried to puff out his chest. He tried to use volume to hide his nerves. "I told your guys the money's tied up in the audit," Miller shouted over the noise of a crane. "You can't just show up here." Gotti didn't shout back. He didn't even move. He stood perfectly still, his hands in his pockets, a slight, almost bored smile on his face. He let Miller scream for 2 full minutes. He let the foreman exhaust his anger, his excuses, and finally, his breath. The silence that followed was heavier than the steel beams hanging overhead. "Are you done?" Gotti asked softly. Miller stammered, I just need more time." Gotti stepped into Miller's personal space. He didn't hit him. He simply adjusted the foreman's hard hat with a terrifyingly gentle touch. "The rule, Tony," Gotti said, looking back at his protégé, "is that respect is the byproduct of absolute certainty. If they think there's a 1% chance you're bluffing, they'll take 100% of your pride." He turned back to Miller. "Tomorrow at dawn, or I'll let the concrete speak for me." As they walked away, Tony felt a shift in the atmosphere. The workers weren't just watching Gotti. They were cataloguing his movement. Gotti wasn't a man. He was an inevitability. "You see, Tony," Gotti said as they got back into the black Cadillac, "you try to be their friend. You try to negotiate. You think being nice is a strategy. It's not. It's a confession that you don't belong here. You have to be the person they see when they close their eyes at night." Tony looked at his own reflection in the window. For the first time, he didn't see a failure. He saw a man who finally understood that in the streets, silence is louder than any scream. 48 hours later, a back room of a sports bar in Brooklyn. The test was simple. Collect a $10,000 gambling debt from a local bookie named Sal the Saint. Sal was known for being a slippery character, always claiming he'd been robbed or that his mother was in the hospital. In the past, Tony would have listened to the stories and left with a maybe next time. Tonight was different. Tony walked into the bar, the smell of fried grease and stale beer hitting him. He found Sal in the back counting receipts. Sal looked up, saw Tony, and rolled his eyes. "Hey, Suits, tell the bosses the check's in the mail, all right? I'm busy here." The old Tony would have stuttered an apology. The new Tony remembered the construction site. He remembered the stillness of Gotti. He didn't say a word. He walked over to the table, pulled out a chair, and sat down directly across from Sal. He stared. He didn't blink. He didn't look at the money on the table. He just looked into Sal's eyes. 30 seconds passed. The jukebox was playing a Billy Joel song, but to Tony, the world was silent. "What's with you?" Sal asked, his voice cracking slightly. "I said I don't have it." Tony leaned forward, mimicking Gotti's predatory calm. "Sal, I'm not here to talk about what you don't have. I'm here to decide what you're going to lose. Your car, your shop, or the hand you're using to count that money." The threat wasn't screamed. It was whispered with the cold certainty of a winter frost. Sal looked at Tony's face. He didn't see the joke anymore. He saw a man who had been given a direct order by the Teflon Don. Sal reached under the desk and pulled out a thick envelope. "Look, kid, no need to get crazy. I was just joking with you." Tony took the envelope, counted it slowly, very slowly, and then stood up. He didn't say thank you. He didn't say have a nice night. He simply turned and walked out. Outside, the cold air felt like a victory. He had used the one rule, absolute certainty. He had earned his first real taste of respect. But as he drove back to Queens, a dark thought flickered in his mind. Respect is a drug, and once you start taking it, you'll do anything to keep the high going, even if it means crossing a line you can never uncross. December 16th, 1985. Sparks Steakhouse, Manhattan. The world changed tonight. The old guard of the Gambino family, Paul Castellano, was gunned down in the street in a hail of bullets. Tony wasn't one of the shooters, but he was on the perimeter, watching the chaos from a getaway car 2 blocks away. The news hit the radio like a bomb. Gotti had taken the throne. The dapper Don was no longer just a captain. He was the king of New York. And Tony Valenti was now part of the inner circle of a man who had just declared war on the entire establishment. The celebration at the Bergen Club that night was manic. Champagne flowed like water. Men who had ignored Tony weeks ago were now slapping him on the back, asking for his opinion. Gotti sat at the head of the table, the undisputed sun around which everyone else orbited. "You did well with Sal," Gotti said, pulling Tony aside. The room went quiet, acknowledging the favor. "But the rules have changed. We don't just collect now, we rule. And ruling requires a different kind of respect. It requires sacrifice." Gotti handed Tony a heavy object wrapped in a silk cloth. Tony didn't need to unwrap it to know it was a 9mm Beretta. "There's a guy named Joey the Rat Luco," Gotti said, his voice dropping to a level only Tony could hear. "He's been talking to the feds about the construction contracts. He's at a warehouse in Red Hook right now. He thinks he's safe because he's family to a captain in Jersey." Gotti gripped Tony's shoulder. The grip was firm, almost fatherly, but the eyes were as cold as a morgue slab. "You've learned how to look like a man, Tony. Now show me you have the stomach to stay one. The one rule, if they think you'll hesitate, you've already lost." Tony felt the weight of the gun. This wasn't about money anymore. This wasn't about being Tony Suits. This was about the point of no return. The atmosphere in the club felt electric, charged with the scent of gunpowder and expensive cigars. Tony walked out into the night. The city looked different now, sharper, more jagged. He was no longer a spectator in the drama of New York. He was the lead actor, and the script was written in blood. 0215, a derelict warehouse, Red Hook, Brooklyn. The smell of salt and rotting wood filled the air. Tony moved through the shadows of the warehouse, his heart drumming a rhythm of pure terror. In his hand, the Beretta felt like it weighed 100 pounds. He found Joey Luco sitting on a crate smoking a cigarette. Joey was an old man, his hair thin and his hands trembling. He wasn't a monster. He was a frightened grandfather who had made a deal to save his own skin. When he saw Tony, he didn't reach for a gun. He just closed his eyes. "They sent you, Tony?" Joey whispered. "I remember when you were a kid. I gave you candy at your uncle's wake." Tony froze. The one rule was screaming in his head, absolute certainty. But looking at Joey, the certainty began to crack. He saw his own father in the man's weathered face. He saw the neighborhood, the Sundays at church, the life he was about to throw away for a man who wore $5,000 suits. "You shouldn't have talked, Joey," Tony said, his voice trembling. "I have a family, Tony. The feds. They promised they'd protect them." "Nobody can protect you from us," Tony replied, the words feeling like ash in his mouth. He raised the gun. The warehouse was silent, except for the distant sound of a foghorn on the river. This was the moment, the decision that would define him. If he pulled the trigger, he was a made man, a legend in the making. If he didn't, he was a dead man by sunrise. Tony thought of Gotti's face. He thought of the respect he had felt for the first time in his life. He realized that respect in this world wasn't about love. It was about the fear you could instill in others to keep yourself safe. A single shot echoed through the warehouse, scaring a flock of pigeons into the night sky. Tony didn't look at the body. He turned and ran into the darkness, the smell of cordite clinging to his hair like a curse. He had followed the rule. He had eliminated the doubt. But as he drove away, he realized that the loudest sound in the world isn't a gunshot. It's the silence of your own soul dying. 1 week later, the Ravenite Social Club, Mulberry Street. Tony was no longer Tony Suits. The guys now called him Tony Steele. He was Gotti's golden boy, the one who didn't blink. He sat in the inner sanctum of the Ravenite, watching Gotti hold court. The FBI was parked outside in vans, their cameras clicking every time a door opened. Gotti didn't care. He walked out to the sidewalk, joked with the agents, and adjusted his tie for the cameras. "Look at them," Gotti laughed, gesturing toward the hidden mics. "They think they can catch lightning in a bottle. They don't understand that we are the bottle." Tony watched Gotti with a mixture of awe and growing dread. Gotti was becoming a celebrity, a folk hero. People in the neighborhood cheered when he walked by. He was the man who beat the system, the man who stood up to the government. He was the Teflon Don. But Tony saw the cracks. He saw the way Gotti's ego was beginning to eclipse his judgment. The one rule was being taken to an extreme. Gotti wasn't just demanding respect, he was demanding worship, and anyone who didn't bow low enough was marked. "Tony," Gotti said, leaning back in his leather chair, "I need you to take a trip to Philly. Some of the guys there are getting restless. They think I'm too loud. Shall I remind them why being loud is a privilege they haven't earned?" Tony nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He had been seeing Joey Luco's face in his dreams every night. He saw the blood on the warehouse floor. He realized that Gotti's respect was a pyramid scheme built on corpses. The FBI wasn't just watching Gotti, they were watching Tony too. He felt the net closing in. The city that had once felt like his playground now felt like a cage. Every siren made him jump. Every black sedan made him reach for his waistband. Gotti was a myth, but myths have a habit of being destroyed by reality, and Tony didn't want to be the collateral damage. February 1987, a cold afternoon in Central Park. Tony met a man on a bench near the reservoir. The man wasn't a mobster, he was an assistant U.S. attorney. His name was Miller, the same name as the foreman Gotti had intimidated a year ago. A coincidence, or a message from the universe? "We have you on the Red Hook hit, Tony," Miller said, looking out over the frozen water. "We have the gun. We have a witness. You're looking at life without parole." Tony didn't say anything. He watched a young couple skating in the distance. He thought about the one rule man absolute certainty. If he talked, he was a rat. If he stayed silent, he was a martyr for a man who wouldn't remember his name in 5 years. "John Gotti doesn't care about you, Tony," the prosecutor continued. "To him, you're a tool. When a tool gets dull, you throw it away. Look what he's doing. He's putting everyone in the crosshairs because he likes the attention. He's not a boss. He's a target." Tony felt the weight of the betrayal, not against Gotti, but against the kid he used to be. The kid who just wanted to belong. He realized that the rule to earn respect was a lie. You don't earn respect in the mob, you just rent it, and the interest rates are lethal. "I need time," Tony whispered. "You don't have time. Gotti is already suspicious of your Philly trip results. He knows you didn't push as hard as he wanted. He's starting to think you're an anchor again." The word hit Tony like a physical blow. Anchor. The last time Gotti called him that, they were in an alley with a dying man. Tony stood up and walked away, leaving the prosecutor on the bench. He had to make a choice, the rule of the street or the rule of survival. One led to a grave, the other to a lifetime of looking over his shoulder. March 1987, Gotti's private suite at a Manhattan hotel. The dinner was lavish. Lobster, steak, the finest wines. Gotti was in high spirits, having just been acquitted in another trial. The headlines called him invincible. He was at the peak of his power. Tony sat to his right. He couldn't eat. Every time Gotti looked at him, Tony felt like he was being dissected. "You've been quiet lately, Steele," Gotti said, cutting into a rare steak. "A man who's quiet is either thinking too much or hiding too much. Which one is it?" The room went cold. The other men at the table, killers, thieves, earners, stopped chewing. Tony looked Gotti in the eye. He used the one rule for the last time. He didn't blink. He didn't stutter. "I'm thinking about the future, John. Thinking about how long this can last." Gotti laughed, but it didn't reach his eyes. "It lasts as long as we have the stones to keep it. You remember what I taught you about certainty? I'm certain that New York is mine. Are you certain you're still with me?" Tony felt the pressure of a gun barrel against his leg under the table. It wasn't his gun. It belonged to the man sitting to his left. He realized he had been lured here to be executed. The Teflon Don didn't allow for doubt. "I'm with the family, John," Tony said. "Always." At that moment, the door burst open. Not the feds, but a waiter with another bottle of wine. The tension broke, but only for a second. Tony knew he had minutes to live. He stood up, excusing himself to go to the restroom. He didn't go to the restroom. He went to the service stairs. He ran down 20 flights of stairs, his heart screaming, his lungs burning just like that night in the alleyway. He burst out into the Manhattan traffic, disappearing into the sea of yellow cabs and neon lights. He had broken the rule. He had shown doubt. And in the world of John Gotti, doubt is the only sin that can't be forgiven. The man now known as David sits on his porch, watching the sun set over the desert. He has a different face, a different name, and a different life. He works at a hardware store, he pays his taxes, he is a nobody. John Gotti died in prison years ago, ravaged by cancer. His empire crumbled into dust. The dapper Don became a cautionary tale, a legend that ended in a 6x9 cell. The respect he commanded turned out to be as hollow as the statues in a cemetery. Tony, David, reaches for a glass of water. His hands still shake sometimes. He remembers the one rule. He realizes Gotti was wrong. Respect isn't about making people fear you. It's about being able to look at yourself in the mirror without wanting to break it. He survived because he realized that the most dangerous thing in the world isn't a man with a gun. It's a man with a philosophy that justifies murder for the sake of ego. He lost everything, his home, his family, his identity, but he gained his life. In the end, Tony Valenti didn't become a mob legend. He became a ghost. And in the world of true crime, being a ghost is the only way to get a happy ending. They still talk about the kid who disappeared, the one who Gotti supposedly taught a lesson. They don't know the truth. They don't know that the student learned the lesson too well. He learned that the only way to win Gotti's game was to stop playing. The story of the Gambino family is a dark mirror of the American dream. We see the suits, the power and the charisma, but we rarely see the cost. Tony Valenti paid that cost in full. What would you have done in Tony's shoes? Would you have pulled the trigger to earn the respect of a king, or would you have walked away into the shadows of a new life? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this dive into the golden age of the New York mob, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the legends of the underworld.